Every story begins with a spark. A single page, a single voice, a single chapter. Welcome to Chapter 1, where our authors take you on the journey in their own words. Settle in, listen closely. This is where the adventure begins. Hi, I'm Chelsea Burton Dunn, the author of the By Moonlight series, and I will be reading Chapter 1 from By Moonlight to you. It was a warm June day in Kansas City. Not so hot that it was unbearable, but the kind of perfect weather that had everyone opening their windows and doors. Door-propping weather, which was exactly what most of the little shops on the Roanoke strip of Westport Road were doing, including the little locksmith shop called The Missing Key. Inside, thoroughly enjoying the breeze wafting through, was the owner of that shop, V, fixing a safe for a client. She was secretly hoping a house call came through so she could put all the windows down in her Lemon, a 1990 Chevy Lumina, and have a reason to get out of the shop. She was still in her 20s, nearing 30, and she loved the simplicity of her little life. She had owned her own shop, manned it alone, lived alone, and liked it that way. National Talk Radio is on in the background, giving the latest update on the deaths that have been seen popping up from New York all the way down and across to Illinois. Brutal killings that initially investigators had suspected were the work of some sort of rabid animal, but now that they'd continued in a straight trajectory, they were concerned it would be a human. V wasn't usually a fan of true crime, but something about this made her skin crawl, more than normal. Between the talk on the newest victim and the broken safe before her, she was zoning out. She pulled out parts and replaced them when suddenly there was a shadow over her work and a block to her breeze. "Hello, V. It's nearly noon," came the familiar deep tone of her friend, Duran. She was her only friend, having met her when she first got back to the city as a customer in the restaurant she worked at. Like clockwork, Duran was there on Friday to take her, well, more like drag her out to lunch. V looked up at her through the curtain of bangs that often obscured her large emerald eyes, her magnifiers down at the end of her nose. "Just let me—" "It will be there at 12:30 when you come back," Duran said, raising one of her black, unruly eyebrows at her. V rolled her eyes, putting down her tools and feigning irritation. She turned her answering machine from the lunch recording, switched off the radio, and grabbed her messenger bag, heading to the open door to lock up. Despite the nice weather, she still dressed in an overly large clothes, mostly in gray. She didn't like getting attention, and though she never put much thought into her petite body, she was also female. She, unfortunately, knew more about what went on in the heads of men than the average person, causing not so unfounded doubts. Not that those doubts weren't justified, hence why she tried to cover up. If it was hard to see, it was hard to fantasize about, right? There were so many restaurants in the Westport neighborhood, so it wasn't a far walk to any of them, but like usual, they settled for one of the Mexican restaurants just down the street from her shop. She often felt paranoid about leaving longer than the 30-minute interval she set on her door sign and the voice message. She didn't want to scare off any potential customers. "So what's the schedule like for today?" Duran asked once she held the door open to the restaurant she had selected. Over the years, Duran had stopped letting V have input on lunch decisions, since she could never make up her mind. "Repairing that old safe, and I have some padlocks I need to finish up. The heart-shaped ones seem to be the best sellers for some reason," V told her, glancing over the menu, even though she knew exactly what she was going to order. "Yes, for some reason people gravitate toward heart-shaped locks and keys." "I wonder why," Duran said sarcastically, rolling her eyes as dramatically as possible. V narrowed her eyes at her friend from across the table, but was momentarily saved from their conversation as their server happened to come by to set down chips and salsa before them. You know, you could make it a full hour since you own the place, or even hire a part-time employee, Duran suggested, as she had many times before. V knew she was just looking out for her well-being. Duran thought she was overworked, but V didn't want to miss the business. Honestly, she felt like she was barely holding on financially. She couldn't afford to take time off or have extended lunch hours, let alone pay another employee. Employee means money. Did I miss the line of customers and overly filled voicemail back at the shop? She asked sarcastically, munching loudly on a chip. You shouldn't work yourself so hard. It's okay to have a life too. To that, she scoffed, saying things like, it's okay to have a life, suggested that she didn't already have one. She was comfortable with her little routine, and quite frankly, so was Duran. She would stop by at least once a day and on Fridays for lunch. What would she do if V wasn't available whenever she wanted to drop in? So you're keeping up with that story? Duran asked, changing the subject abruptly and lacing her fingers together before her. She looked questioningly at V as she referred to the radio program that had been on in the shop. It's just a little strange. Figured I should stay in the know, V said, shrugging. The overly cheerful server came back to take their orders before Duran could ask any more questions about V's sudden true crime interest, and V cringed a little when the poor girl talked. Just a little cringe that only someone who knew V could spot, but Duran certainly knew her. People put on fake emotions all the time, V. I feel like you should be used to that, she said once the server left, watching V's shoulders rise with tension ever so slightly. Not usually this bad, she murmured, snapping a chip that she'd been scooping salsa with, and mournfully watched the chip piece get consumed by the spicy red goodness. It is the first full moon tonight, Duran said, trying to be nonchalant, but it wasn't really working. The 3 nights surrounding the full moon brought out a lot of, let's say, interesting behavior. Well, crap. Late night at the shop isn't going to work then, she grumbled, managing to scoop the drowned piece with another chip. No, it's best you get home before sundown. I have a bad feeling. Unfortunately, Duran's bad feelings usually turned out to be true. V did have quite a few orders to finish up for tomorrow, but they would have to wait. It would have to be an early morning at the shop instead of a late night. As they walked back, her work cell buzzed in her pocket, and Duran grabbed it before V could, making her narrow her eyes as she tried to swipe it back out of Duran's grip. It's not 12:30 yet, Duran said, chuckling at her frustration. House call, V snapped, snatching the phone from her hand and swiping hastily to answer. The missing key, locksmith and repairs, how can I help you? She said, her voice strictly professional, but not that high-pitched fake happy tone some people take on when talking to customers, like their server, for example. V never understood why any customer would take that as genuine. She did have a slight advantage to seeing through these social lies, however. She was an empath, capable of feeling others' emotions. So while the server had put on a very fake tone of voice and smile, V could also feel how much she hated doing it. The resentment seeped from the girl like poisonous gas, and since the 3 nights of the full moon were starting, V was a little more sensitive than usual. The customer on the phone didn't seem to care that V made no attempts at being overly friendly, though. They were clearly more concerned about the fact that they were locked out of their house and their car. Rushing inside her shop, Duran in tow, she scribbled the name of the customer and the address, and gave an approximate time of arrival before hanging up and switching the voicemail from message from lunch to house call recording. I have work to do, otherwise I'd watch the shop for you, Duran said, half joking as they both walked out the door, V quickly locking it behind them. Don't you have wards that need watching instead of my tiny lock shop? V asked, playing into the joke as she walked to her car. The only reason I can't, Duran hollered back at her, waving from the sidewalk. Along with being an empath, V could sense the presence of others, beings that were not human. They had a different feel in her brain. When she was a teenager, she learned about what different types of preternatural beings were and how they felt inside her head. Duran was no human. She was a watcher. It's hard to describe what a watcher is exactly. They were some of the most powerful and oldest beings that walked this plane. Watchers had a ward, sometimes two, that they oversaw and assured no harm came to them. Usually the ward was chosen because they were thought to be of some importance in the future. They were not only incredibly powerful beings, but also extremely secretive. The little information that Vi knew about them was more than many others had. From what she had gleaned, even some other types of preternaturals didn't know if Watchers were real. As Vi drove to the house on Morningside Drive, she considered what Duran must do every day. Obviously, she would take breaks from whomever she was charged with watching to come by and see her. She wondered if she was Duran's only friend, like she was hers. Morningside was one of those strange streets in the city that decided to be different. Most streets and neighborhoods were carefully planned grid of blocks, but no, not Morningside. A very rich man by the name of J.C. Nichols owned the property formerly known as Brookside, and his friend, Fletcher Cowhert, created the exceptionally wide, luxurious street. The homes were large, not mansions, but quite massive from Vi's modest view. Her entire one-bedroom apartment would fit inside one of the kitchens of these houses. She pulled up to the address and found a distraught woman pacing outside her house. She was dressed nicely, a blue silk top that accentuated her bright blue eyes, tucked into linen pants, as if she had just come from her office for lunch when the mistake had been made. "Hello, I'm Vi, your locksmith," Vi said in greeting as she got out of the car. She had helped this woman, Cora Byers, many times, but she always felt the need to reintroduce herself. In her opinion, she wasn't a particularly memorable person, or she certainly tried not to be, so it shocked her a little when Cora's face turned to a familiar smile. "Oh, my God! Thank you so much. I feel like we call you all the time, and you're always so quick. I just moved too fast for my brain to keep up. Our back door has a knob lock, and I usually use when I'm trying to leave in a hurry. Well, I hurried out so fast I left my keys on the counter of the kitchen, and this is really not the day for this," she said, speaking very quickly, her curtain of blonde hair whipping around as she walked toward the back of the house to show Vi the door in question. The house was, as most of them were in that neighborhood, a center hall-style colonial. The basic plan of a colonial was a 2- or 3-story rectangle, with the rooms flanking a centralized hallway. Vi couldn't help but marvel at the perfection of this side of the house. It was one thing to have your front yard manicured, but it was quite another to have the side of your house also beautifully landscaped, with plants edging the driveway. Even the paint was immaculate. "This one," Cora said, gesturing to the back door. Now that she was in front of it, looking at the knob and lock, Vi felt that this particular lock was very familiar. Not that there weren't plenty of locks that looked similar, but this one she knew, like she had repaired it once before. She felt bad when she didn't always remember the exact situation she had dealt with when helping a repeat client. "Not a problem. I'll pick it quickly if you just show me your ID, so I can assure you aren't trying to rob the place," Vi said with a wink. "Oh, of course," Cora said, rummaging through her purse for her wallet and pulling out her driver's license. Vi was not surprised that the driver's license photo was one to envy. Cora happened to be one of the few people who actually looked good in hers. "Perfect. Just give me a few minutes," Vi said, pulling her tools from her bag and looking the lock over. Yes, this was definitely the same lock she had repaired, and this was definitely a house with something other living there. Not Cora, though. That woman was completely human. She tried to recall what kind lived here. Werewolves? Had to be. This whole neighborhood had them dotted here and there. The pack leader must live nearby to have so many in such a small radius. She made quick work of it, picking the lock and making a few tightening adjustments as Cora ran in and grabbed her keys from the very lovely kitchen counter. It was all quartz counters and delicate white tiles, clean as a whistle and shining. It could have been ripped right out of a magazine. Vi felt dirty just standing in that room. "Oh, thank you so much. I don't know what I would have done. The run is tonight. I have so many things to get for the pet." Cora nearly choked on her words. Vi felt the anxiety burst out of the woman in waves. She messed up, and any other person would probably question what she stopped short of saying, but luckily she had V. She knew Cora was going to say pack, but V didn't need to be asking questions she already knew the answers to. That would only bring unwanted attention her way. Not to worry, I was looking for an excuse to get out of my shop and into this beautiful weather, V said quickly, making it as if there was no secrets almost revealed or awkward, anxiety-filled pauses. V didn't want to be revealed herself, let alone get tangled in something with werewolves. Cora paid V a check, thanked her again profusely, and hastily pulled out of the driveway and out of sight, southward bound for the grocery store, V imagined. She sat in front of the house looking around the street for a moment. When she had made other house calls on the street and in this neighborhood before, she had realized several of them were werewolves at the time and kept her head down. No one had ever suspected that she was something other, save for Duran. Anyone else who had ever known was because she revealed it to them. They say it's a small world, and Kansas City was certainly an incestuous city. There were connections everywhere. She knew that when she came back. Sometimes that knowledge worried her, that she would be found out with all the preternaturals in the area. There were territories, nests, and districts of all kinds hidden right before the humans' very eyes. It was a wonder that the humans seemed blinded to it all. At that thought, she shook her head and smiled, momentarily considering herself not human. She was human, or human enough, for other preternaturals to not give her a second thought. As she started her car, she noticed a man come out of one of the houses across the street. He had clearly come out to greet the person in the car that had just pulled into his driveway. He was tall, broad, olive-skinned, and dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt. She could tell he was well muscled underneath the clothes, which seemed to be tailored specifically for him. His hair was slightly salt and pepper by his temples, but mostly a deep dark brown that was nearly black. She had never seen him in that house before, but she knew she'd also worked on those locks before. This pack, she decided, seemed to need replacements and repairs on both house and car parts on a regular basis. But it was usually someone else that called on her. She had never seen him, but she felt his power. Just the way he stood there, talking to the equally large man who had gotten out of the car. He owned that house. It was his property. She rolled her eyes at him and her own reaction to seeing him as she drove away. Yes, he was attractive. Yes, she had been to that home, but she didn't need to be ogling the man or wondering about him. He was clearly out of her league for many reasons, one being he was very much a werewolf. She already got close to them often enough with a regular need of her services. She was just lonely. No need to be looking him up and down. She sighed as she pulled back up to her shop. It was the first full moon of the summer in Westport. Unless she had walk-ins for custom pieces or a key duplication, she doubted she would get much business for the last few hours of the day. Although she would most likely have plenty of house calls tomorrow when people realized they lost their keys at the bar that night. She walked back in after unlocking, switching the sign to open from "Be back soon" on a house call. She glanced at the little mail drop to see if anyone had left anything before changing the shop voicemail back to ring. After setting her bag down, she looked again at the project she'd been working on prior to her lunch with Duran. She was nearly done with the safe repair. Of course, she had more of those heart locks to complete, and the other was a restoration of a lock from one of the historic homes in the area. These were some of her favorites to work on, restoring old locks from 100-year-old homes so they could go back where they belonged and be used for 100 years more. There was something magical about that. Many locksmiths only replaced, not repaired or restored. The number of people who would go out of their way to ensure they could keep an original lock was always surprising to her. Donning her magnifier, she settled in to finish the safe. The last of the afternoon flew by. Only a few window shoppers came in to peek at some of the things she had on display. Since she was planning on making a few more, she had recently put out her display heart padlocks again. They looked old and weathered, the perfect size for locking a chest, like from a fairy tale. As she cleaned up for the night and balanced her register, she somehow got lost in the thought of fairy tales. It amused her that so many of them actually held truth. She would have never known when she was small and her mother read them to her that the fairies, witches, and other monsters in those books actually lived amongst them. Vi had started her life fairly normally. She had 2 loving parents and a sister, Eliza. But she always felt like something was not right, something was different. Her sister would tease her that she was adopted or tell her she was too weird to ever be accepted into normal society. Despite her sister's obvious mixed feelings towards her, when tragedy struck their home, Eliza did the right thing. Vi was not quite 10 when her parents died. The nature of their deaths was kept from her, but from what she gathered, it was horrific. Eliza had just graduated high school and took the responsibility of raising Vi herself. While the sacrifice was great and Vi appreciated it, there were obvious problems. Eliza clearly blamed Vi for their misfortunes, whether warranted or not. "Eliza, the lights don't work," a little Vi said, wandering into the living room where her sister usually fell asleep. "Yes, because you needed to get new shoes. That's why the lights don't work," Eliza would snap, malice thick in her voice as she used a flashlight to look over bills. "But they wouldn't let me wear them to school anymore. The sole was falling off," Vi said, trying to fight back tears. "You shouldn't run around so much and wear them down then," was all Eliza said. It was those moments and the overwhelming emotions she felt from her sister that finally built up enough guilt to force Vi to leave. She knew that if she was gone, her sister would move on to something better for herself, and maybe Vi could too. She left Kansas City and managed to get to St. Louis. She stayed hidden with a small, unlikely group of friends she made there. They finished school together, watched out for each other, and taught her more about herself and the world than she'd ever known before. Unfortunately, that time became a black mark in her heart too when her new little family fell apart as well. She escaped back to Kansas City and tried to make something out of herself. Her first job had been a little breakfast restaurant in Westport, just a few blocks from where her shop was now. She didn't make much money there, but she scrimped and saved enough to get training on becoming a locksmith. Her frugality paid off when she eventually got to open her own business. She accomplished a lot with no upsetting mishaps in the 10 years she spent alone than she had ever been able to do before. So she decided she was just a person who needed to be that way. She needed solitude to survive. She supposed she was thankful for the first 10 years she had with her parents. Even for the short time she had and remembered them, her mother ignited her imagination and encouraged her empathetic gifts, even if it scared them a little. Her mother, Sarah, had been a far cry from Eliza's parenting, since Vi was only ever admonished at the mere mention of her abilities. It made Vi wonder about Eliza's daughter. Very rarely did Vi see her sister, let alone her little family. When Vi moved back to Kansas City, Eliza was already married and wanted nothing to do with her. She could respect that, having felt like she was a burden to her sister despite not meaning to be. Vi stayed away. She stayed in her lonesome existence since she felt like every relationship she touched turned to ashes. Just her presence destroyed the people around her. The only time she ever saw Eliza were when she would randomly stop by the shop. It was usually for something dumb. She needed a spare key for her car. She found something in storage that was Vi's from her teenage years and didn't want it taking up space in her home anymore. The visits always seemed strange and unnecessary, especially considering it was a bit out of Eliza's way to get to her shop. Vi continued thinking about her sister as she walked to her car. She patted the hood as she climbed in, babying it as much as she could, hoping that it would keep it going for a little while longer. She was saving to replace it with something that was a bit more practical and reliable for work, and she was very nearly there. She estimated, given no unforeseen mishaps, she'd have enough for a decent vehicle by August. She drove through the side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares of Midtown, as they were already overcrowded with the Friday night traffic. Everyone wanted to drink away their problems after a week at work. She couldn't sympathize, mostly because her work was her life. She shook her head as she arrived at her apartment, shooing away the thoughts of her sister and the little intrusive thoughts of the werewolf she had seen earlier in the day from her mind. She had to get back to her own reality. She was meant to be alone. The first chapter has been read, but the story has only just begun. Join us again for more voices, more worlds, more Chapter 1.